This session is called Sustainable Networks, and we will present a longitudinal perspective on a 3 years faculty learning community project. I'm Gaia Scagnetti Huang. I'm the Assistant Dean of the School of Design and a full-time professor in Graduate Communication Design at Pratt Institute.
I'm Heather Lewis, Professor, Art and Design Education.
So what we are presenting today are the early findings on a long-term impact of the faculty learning communities that lasted for 3 years. And when we talk about faculty learning communities in this context, we're really referring to a community of faculty and actually administrators that were engaged in synergistic knowledge development in the cause of student and faculty learning, and with the goal of transforming our institution into a learning organization. So creating a space for faculty to learn and discuss, and for making student access and student success more achievable.
So it's important, the institutional context is important here. When the project began in 2015, simultaneously we were establishing a new Center for Teaching and Learning, redesigning program curriculum across the Institute, and focusing on teaching and learning among art and design schools nationally and internationally. So that context is important because many of the same people involved in the FLC, which is new for us, that was the first FLC on the campus, were involved in many of these other initiatives. So there's a very reciprocal and dynamic relationship between the FLC work and other initiatives on the campus. So we began the project in 2015 with institutional support for 5 cross-disciplinary FLCs made up of 40 faculty and administrators from across the institution. So what type of institutional support at the time? We had food, which we found out subsequently was incredibly important. Stipends for part-time faculty. We have a large number of part-time faculty at the Institute. Opportunities to share work in progress throughout the 3 years, and opportunities to attend conferences as teams. And the topics of the FLCs, which again were cross-disciplinary. One was learning in the first year, transfer of learning across the 4 years, Crit the Crit, which is that's art school language for really student assessment. And narrative and student cognition, and self-assessment through e-portfolios. So to prepare for the work, because no one had actually run or been engaged in an FLC before, we had a full day session with an external consultant focused on the facilitators who would lead the groups. And it was important we had 2 facilitators. This is cross-disciplinary, really important to have people from different disciplines leading. And they helped, and their charge was to lead a shared investigation of a common interdisciplinary research topic over the 3 years. They committed for 3 years. And they developed other roles too. Their initial charge was to lead the investigation and the research, but they realized quickly that they were also advocates for ISSOTL and for FLCs at the institutional level. And that they learned at the beginning they were responsible for this, but it was a real challenge because we developed an approach that was open-ended and did not want to impose a product at the end, that it would come about through their collaborative methodological approach. It's a very different process, I think, than many of the FLC's processes. So you can see here the facilitator and his first day of orientation to his role, writing down his notes, and rule number 1, anything we say stays here. Acknowledging the power imbalances of different faculty ranks, which is, again, I want to emphasize, very significant in our institution, and valuing every voice. A few other notes from Chris, I can mention his name. Avoiding privileging a particular discipline, which was also something that was important to emphasize right at the beginning. But at the same time, to do that, starting to develop a common terminology and semantics across disciplines, which was, I would say, a good part of the first year of the effort, was just developing shared language. And then the most challenging, I would say, part, was which I mentioned earlier, was this deliverable conundrum, which was we were not imposing from the beginning a deliverable. It was going to evolve out of a iterative goal-making process. And you can see his note there, fail, ambiguity of purpose. This is a scientist. He was really uncomfortable. You can see that. Some of the humanities and arts people weren't so uncomfortable, but he was very uncomfortable. Go ahead.
So after the 3 years of the FLC in 2019, we presented the results of a qualitative research study that we conducted 6 months after the completion of the project. And we presented at ISSOTL in 19 conference in person at that time. At that time, the methodology was like, we took a phenomenological approach and we did some semi-structured interviews with the participant of the FLC. We did some analysis of the natural documents they produced, like reports and other documentation. And then we did a diagrammatic analysis of the phases of the FLC to understand what happened and to assess the work. And at that time, what we discovered and what the argument of our paper that was called FLCs as an inclusive incubator for social research was that if we had to build an inclusive and a long-term faculty learning community, then the approach should be slow, so no rushing it, non-linear and iterative, so not really knowing what would happen, and let freedom to the participant to determine the direction of the questions that were asked in their group, and should be deliberative and creative. And we discussed this in the context of like institutional support and in the context of like often research culture that prioritize outcome over process. And then after this project, formally funded period, so after the end of the FLC, many of the participants sustained a personal network that they have developed within the group, which span institutional and disciplinary boundaries. So they had like network across disciplinary with people that were not necessarily direct colleagues to them. And so we decided to expand the studies. And this was kind of the justification of this research. We really observe and notice that the network that was built during those years sustained many years after.
And so to do the research, we followed the people and their lived experiences through shared personal narratives. So that really was 5 years after the FLC started, based on those sources. So we were interested in the structures and processes that supported both the personal and emotional dimensions of the project, as well as the professional and interdisciplinary experiences and perspectives. So the first stage, and this is happened right before COVID, included a 2-hour semi-structured focus group, which we recorded, we transcribed, and we've analyzed through grounded theory. And again, COVID interrupted some of this research, so we're kind of just back to finishing it up. But this is where we started. And the prompts for the focus group were, how did your participation in the FLC influence your relationships and your social and emotional life at Pratt? Share your most memorable moments in the FLC, and how did your thinking, practice, and professional trajectory change over time, both during and after your participation in the FLC? So, after analyzing the results of these groups and focus groups that were divided, we did a focus group with the larger group, and then we broke up into like smaller groups and continue the conversation. So after analyzing and transcribing and coding the results, we found that the faculty learning community had fostered long-term personal network
across discipline, across position, and across institutional context. So people basically developed connection with other colleagues were not only from other school and other disciplines, but in different positions, part-time, full-time, staff, etc., and across an institutional context that see very different disciplinary environments in an art and design school. And that network sustain the well-being of the people involved, especially through difficult time, for example, COVID, through the social dynamics that emerged after those work were done together. And so which type of networks are we talking about? And here we are quoting some of the literally spoken words that we found during the interviews. So one of the things is that friendship and emotional support came up of working together on a shared topic across discipline. One of the members said, I gained support from colleagues and network in a way that helped me remain a path when I wasn't sure I would, remain in academia when I wasn't sure that I would, understand my identity as a researcher when I was afraid to claim it. So that support that came out of working together for so many years continue through the career of the people who participate and help them develop their professional and personal lives. They develop long-term ongoing partnerships, some of them, and most of them at different level, and some of them are a very deep level. One of the participants said, I really did get one of my best friends and closest research partners out of this experience. And that's not anything I could have ever foreseen. It had such a huge impact on my personal life, and I didn't expect that from a faculty learning community. It's interesting here that a lot of the participants pointed it out that from a professional environment that is done in an academic environment, they wouldn't expect to find the friendship and support as they did. They also had shared memories. Someone said that the small memories that I still quote, some of you or think about when you said to me that makes me handle my student differently, my children differently, like peer differently, my colleague differently to bigger topics that are bigger questions. So the small moment happen in those groups not only inform the life and personal life, but also like directed larger question, professional questions. There was personal development that came out of these interviews and this analysis. Someone says the FSC gave me a lot of empathy, really. I always thought about individual students and their needs, but having those conversations really helped me realize that more can be done. It helped me guide how I interact with my student and how I don't take for granted anything at this point. So that came with personal development. And also what we have noticed a lot in the way that people talk about that experience, that change made a difference in the retention to the institution. Retention is something we talk a lot about in relationship to staff and faculty. One of the participants says it was actually an investment in being together, and the impact of that on my life as an individual and professional within PATH has been very significant. I would have probably not been here anymore if it wasn't for those type of environment where I felt recognized and heard as a person, but in the context of my disciplinary research. And so what we argue in this research and in the paper is that the intertwined personal and professional development dimensions are inseparable. That the two things, like our personal life and our professional life within academia and within these spaces that are supported by the academic environment, are really inseparable and grow together. One of the participants says, I really feel like there was a connection through our work because we are so emotionally connected to that work. And if we are all connected to that work, then there must be something about it also as a group that brings us together. So the intertwined dimensions of professional level and personal level are really inseparable. And they're usually, unfortunately, separated in academic environments.
This is moving from the individual and the group to the organization. So what we argue and what we are arguing with our administrators is that there needs to be institutional support for the spaces and structures where the professional and the personal are centered. and it seems like very mundane, but food turned out to be so important for people. Time, of course, and longevity, which we're talking about, financial support, in our case, for part-time faculty members, and incentives for interdisciplinary teaching, which it's really incentives and structures that will help sustain that in an environment where that's really, really hard to do. Just bureaucratically. I'm not talking about intentions or will, but just the actual bureaucratic mechanisms that prevent it from happening. And again, but we're arguing that it's not just about promoting interdisciplinary teaching and learning, but it's also about, as importantly, is sustaining faculty and administrators' well-being within the institutional context. Okay, so now we are on with you. We'd love to hear more from you. We have we have 7 minutes left. And I thought, Gaia, that the idea of the peer observation, you might want to share the crit approach. I don't know if it has any relevance, but.
I don't know. I wonder if I mean, this argument and this experience has really allow us to talk within a research context of what does it mean to create friendship and through research, or research through friendship. And I think this is a very under-researched conversation that maybe COVID and the current situation could bring back and give new momentum to, given that sustainability and well-being have a very different meaning right now that they had a few years ago. And so we were kind of interested in this last slide to hear if you, Derek, or RP, if you want to participate, if you have similar experiences where kind of professional and personal network came together in a supported way, or produced different direction of research, or if that experience is actually shared across discipline, across institution. And how can we support those? How can that type of relation being supported at a different level? So I wonder if you have any experience to share with us or thoughts about it.
It's interesting that, Heather, you talked about kind of the mundane, right, of these kinds of things, and the simplicity of breaking bread as a group.
That's what they said.
Right, that's absolutely essential. And I think that, along with the longitudinal aspect of it, that you're doing this regularly and seeing each other in person in that shared environment, that shared space, that's in my personal professional experience at various institutions, that's really where it's those relationships get built, and then they're able to be sustained when you hit these crises, right? So it would have been more difficult to build those, I think, virtually and then sustain that, but to build them physically in person. And then when we did move online in the midst of all this, it was much easier to maintain those. And that's, those are personal, but also professional, in that when you get into professional settings, then you're familiar with the people that you're working with, and that that first slide, the notes about safety, right? And if we have that personal connection already, that safety is a lot easier to establish, and then you can do more as a group if you have that understanding.
Absolutely. I wonder if there is the conversation is really how this type of planning or how this type of values get put within the design of this type of organizations. Institutions are fundamentally very good at avoiding discussing the personal at any cost and kind of focusing on the measurable, even when it's not really measurable. Professional development, is it really measurable? So it's interesting to understand how do we put these cultural factors within the design of offerings for institutions. How do we make it clear that we also center the personal and professional development, that the two things are inseparable. And so the being together, the feeling safe is actually fundamental.
Mm-hmm. I wonder where, like, one of the questions I was thinking about was, where does this move from being a FLC, which, typically has a set duration, to becoming an ongoing community of practice?
Mm-hmm.
And so when you were talking about, this notion of deliverables, it's like, well, I don't know, do you need a deliverable? But I guess that is, that's more to do with the FLC rather than, these longer term goals, which the deliverables are diffuse and you can't necessarily define them in advance. So yeah, I was curious why you decided to do a 3-year FLC as opposed to beginning with this more kind of ongoing community of practice sort of approach.
Well, a lot of it has to do, as I mentioned, with the interdisciplinary nature of the FLC. It became so clear that that is such an ambitious goal, even just to have conversation, not to produce a deliverable, that it took it. Everyone said halfway through the year, we're just beginning to understand our common language. We're just beginning to be able to develop common taxonomy of terms, of ways that we share. So I think at that moment, it was clear that just to do the interdisciplinary work of the FLC, right, would require more time. We followed the Milton Cox formula, right? It was great. All those resources are great. And looking at other people's work. But, the 1 year, we knew right away, this is not possible. We didn't initially say 3 years, by the way. It was very organic. We got support for 1 year, and then we went back right away 6 months and said, we need another year. And then after that year, we said, we need another year because everyone had kind of shaped their deliverable, if you know what I mean. It was very organic, and it was clear, and no one uses that word, by the way. We didn't use that word, but I just use it here. It was clear what people wanted to leave the project with. Very clear. Each one was very, very different. And so I'm kind of describing a more organic process than what, can be conveyed in a PowerPoint. And also, just one thing this is just thinking. It's interesting what you said about communities of practice, because I think what's happened is all of the people not only have sustained in different ways these personal connections, but they've branched off and continued to do work either in the form of more FLC work or a different type of work that's similar, let's say, for example, interdisciplinary, teaching and so forth. So if we were to follow those if we did like a mapping of the individuals and where they went, I think we'd find multiple communities of practice continuing. The question is, would we find it happening in the same way in terms of the personal and the, I don't know. I mean, this is all to be continued in a way.
Yeah, and that is a good closing because it's 12:30, so we'll let Derek and everybody else go into their next session if they want. Thank you very much for being here. Deeply appreciate it.
Thank you for sharing this work.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.